Hello everyone and welcome back to another anatomy tutorial. This is Dr. Ayan from the Veterinary Anatomy channel. Today in this tutorial we will talk about the bones of the skull of the horse. So let's get started. As you can see here we have the skull of the horse. What we are planning to do is to go through the bones, different bones forming the skull in general. And after that, we will put the skull in different views and try to talk about the different features of each single bone here in this skull. Here what we can see the skull and the mandible which articulate together here at this level to form the jaw joint. So we will talk about this also in this presentation or in this video. Now, in general, and this is a good news for all of us, we have the same bones which we have in any other animals, of course, but the shape and the size of the bones differ between the different animal species. So in general, we can divide the bones of the skull into two big groups. The first group called the cranial bones, and from the name we can understand that here we are talking about the bones which are there to form the cranial cavity, or called the cranium, the place where we have the brain. So these bones are there to protect also the brain. The other group called the facial bones, and from the name again, so these are the bones forming the face, so facial bones. Before we start talking about the features of the different bones of the skull, let me just tell you that the skull and the mandible, they provide the framework of the head, and they are there, of course, to protect several very important structures and organs like the brain inside the cranium or the eye inside the orbita, the different parts of the ear, tongue inside the oral cavity, pharynx, and all of this stuff, of course, in addition to the different blood vessels, arteries, veins, and nerves. Now let's start with the cranial bones. And to be able to see all the bones, let's just remove the mandible here and keep only the skull. We have several bones forming the cranial cavity or contributing to the formation of the cranium or cranial cavity. Let's start with the bones which we can see in the dorsal view. So that means here we're talking about the bones forming the roof of the cranial cavity, including from rostral to caudal, the frontal bone. So this and this are the frontal bones. They are paired. That means we have one on the right side, one on the left side. Here in this area we have the parietal bones. They are also paired. That means we have one on the right side, one on the left side. So this is the parietal bone. And here in this area we have a single small bone located normally in all animals between the parietal bones, and that's why we name it the interparietal bone, this one located in this area here. In the horse, we will find also that part of the temporal bone is also located here and forming also part of the roof of the cranial cavity. So now we mentioned again the frontal bone, we mentioned the parietal bone, and the interparietal bone in this area here. Let's move to the lateral view, just like this, and put it in the center. Now in the lateral view, the bone which is there to form the lateral wall of the cranial cavity is a huge bone here called the temporal bone. So this is all the temporal bone, and there are a lot of features, projections, foramens inside the temporal bone, We will talk about it later, but just for your information, all of this starting from this area here and this here are the sutures between the temporal bone and other bones. Can you see the borders here? Yeah, this is all the temporal bone. So temporal bone is one of the cranial bones forming the lateral wall of the cranial cavity. If we move to the floor, so here caudally we have this bone, which is part of the occipital bone called the base occipital bone. So this is the base occipital bone. We will talk about it later, which is, part of this bone is the condyle, the occipital condyle. So base occipital bone, in front of it, and this is the border here, this is the joint, this is the suture between the base occipital bone and this bone. So this bone here called the this is the sphenoid bone. This is the sphenoid bone. In front of the sphenoid bone, we can see here just part of it, this bone here called the presphenoid bone. The presphenoid bone. Okay? The floor of the cranium called the base occipital bone. Here we have the sphenoid bone, and after that with the presphenoid bone. Okay? All three bones here are unpaired. That means we have only one bone, so there's no right and left. Okay? Now if we move all the way to the caudal wall of the skull, and I'm sorry for this, I will try to show you another skull because the scanning here is really not that optimal. Here we can see the occipital bone. The occipital bone normally has three parts. The base occipital bone, which we saw there, let me just try to show you again. Can you see that? So this is the base occipital bone. In the caudal view, we can see the occipital condyles of the base occipital bone here for the articulation with the first cervical vertebra, called the atlas, of course. In the caudal wall here of the cranium, we have also the squamous part of the occipital bone. Now, in the caudal view here, next to the condyles here and here, we have the lateral part of the occipital bone. Okay? The lateral part of the occipital bone forming laterally here what's called the paracondylar processes. So we'll talk about these different features. I will try to show you the occipital bone, another skull, so we will come back to this bone. Now, of course, we can move a little bit now and talk about the facial bones, which we can see in the lateral view. Facial bones, including here dorsally, we have the nasal bone. This is the nasal bone. Just next to the nasal bone here, we have the lacrimal bone. That bone located just on the right or medial angle of the eye and has something to do with the tears, because under this or inside this bone, we will find a canal extending from the orbita up to the nasal cavity. We will talk about this later, called the nasolacrimal canal. So this bone called the lacrimal bone. Here on the side, a very big bone called the maxilla. The maxilla, it's extremely important, and we all know something about the maxilla. Is that bone where we can find the premolar and the molar teeth of the upper jaw, including the canine. So here the incisors and the canines are removed. It's not present here. Here, as we are in this area, we can also find this bone here called the incisive bone. The incisive bone of the skull, let me just move it to this side here so that you can see both incisive bone on each side. So we have on the right and on the left here. This is the incisive bones, where we can find, of course, the incisors. Okay? Now let me just try to show you the incisive bone in all directions. Can you see it? So this is the right incisive bone on the side here, and this is the left one here. Yeah, this is the incisive bone of the skull. Okay. Now if we move a little bit caudally here, we can see another bone called the zygomatic bone. So this bone here, the zygomatic bone, this bone contributes also to the formation of what's called the zygomatic arch. We will talk about this again later. Again, now we are trying just to mention the names of the bones, and after that we will talk about the different features of them. So this is the zygomatic bone. Zygomatic bone. Okay? If we move to the ventral view now, so here in this area we can see the bones forming what's called the hard palate. So this is the hard palate, and the bones contributing or forming the hard palate are 3 bones. The first one is this bone in this area here, this bone here called the palatine bone. Please go ahead and find, this suture between the palatine bone and the maxilla. Can you see the suture? This is the border of the palatine bone. The palatine bone, as you can see here, has 2 plates or 2 parts. This is the horizontal plate of the palatine bone, horizontal plate, which is a little bit bigger in other animals. So it's small here in the horse. If you follow the horizontal plate, you will find that it moves upward. So this is also the palatine bone. Can you see that? This is also the palatine bone, forming what's called the perpendicular plate. Let's move to the other side. I hope it's a little bit more clear there. Yeah, exactly. So stay with me, please. Again, so sorry for this. So this is here the palatine bone, the horizontal plate of the palatine bone. If you follow it, you will find that the palatine bone here on the side forming the perpendicular plate of the palatine bone. On the palatine, okay, so let's continue with the hard palate before moving to the other bone, just like this. Right? So we talked about the horizontal plate of the palatine bone. Just in front of it, here we can see part of the maxilla, and this part of the maxilla in this area is named as palatine process of the maxilla. So we have one on the right, one on the left, yeah? So this is the palatine process of the maxilla. So if you follow this bone here, of course, it's the same, the maxilla, which we saw here in this area. So this is the maxilla, okay? So it's the same bone. Can you see that here? So it's the same bone. So this here is the palatine process of the maxilla. And now from the incisive bone, you will find from each incisive bone we have extra process moving also caudally towards somehow the hard palate or toward the palatine bone, and it forms also the part of the hard palate, this process here called the palatine process of the incisive bone. So we have one here and one there. One here and one there. So these 3 bones, let's say the horizontal plate of the palatine bone, the palatine process of the maxilla, and the palatine process of the incisive bone, they form altogether the bony part of the hard palate. Okay, good. Let's just move to this area again. So we talked about the palatine bone. On the palatine bone, so this is the palatine bone, horizontal plate, and on the side we have the perpendicular plate, yeah? Perpendicular plate here. On the palatine bone here, you can find, I don't know exactly if it's clear, extra bone on the palatine bone, extra bone here called the pterygoid bone. The pterygoid bone here and there. The pterygoid bone ends at this level here with these two projections, one here, one there, called the humulus of the pteroid bone. To understand what I'm talking about, I will move it to this side. Can you see these two projections here? I hope it's clear. So I'm talking about this and that one, called the humulus of the pteroid bone. Humulus of the pteroid bone. Okay, before we go forward and talk about the different features of the other bones, I will finally mention this bone here, this bone called the vomer, which extends inside the nasal cavity all the way forward there, the vomer. We will try to see it inside the nasal cavity later. So this is the bones of the skull in general. Now we will put the skull in different views and try to mention not only the bones, but the projections, foramens, everything important, everything like we should know about the skull and in different views. So see you soon.